Hey there fellow creators, Ben here from Cineblog Studios, and when it comes to painting in acrylics, a lot of people, specifically beginners, tend to struggle a lot with the idea of blending and layering with their paints. Some people come from watercolors, some people from oils, and they come to acrylics and they're like, why doesn't this work the way I want it to? Well, chances are it's because you're treating acrylics like other paints you've tried, and they're not like other paints you've tried. So in this video, I'm going to teach you how to blend and layer with your acrylics just like a pro. Stick around. So, as I just mentioned in the introduction, a lot of people think about acrylics the way they might think about oils or watercolors, in that they can lay paint on the paper or their canvas, blend it out, work their colors wet into wet. But the problem is acrylics don't really do that, and they're not designed for you to do that. That's not what what acrylic paints are for. They're not supposed to be like oils or watercolors. They're a completely different painting medium. And a lot of people do struggle a bit with this at first. They're like, well, I can't get the paint to do what I want. It's like, well, you have to also embrace what the paint wants to do for you, which is usually to layer it rather than blend it. Now, it is possible to blend with acrylics, and we will be talking about that in a little bit. But it's important to note that acrylics are more about layering than they are about blending. When you start to understand that, suddenly the world opens up a little bit when you start working with the paints. So for today's demo, I've stapled down this piece of medium texture cotton duck canvas onto a piece of particle board. Should suffice and be similar to what you'd get out of a standard canvas board. Today you're also going to find my palette cam off to the lower right hand side. I've already laid out my colors here: cadmium red, cad yellow hue, Prussian blue hue, and a little bit of titanium white. And you'll see me reach for those as well as some water as we go forward. My only other two tools today are going to be a relatively small flat brush as well as a painting knife to mix some paint with. Now this particular demo, I'm going to be doing two different versions of the same painting, blending on the left and layering on the right. And for this painting, I'm essentially going to be replicating a piece that I did back when I was about 14 or so, using, at that time, more blending techniques, but I can show you that you can do the same thing just with more layering as well. So the two biggest factors in blending with acrylic have to do with how much paint you use and if you decide to wet your brush, which is vitally important if you're going to be using acrylics at all. You have to, unless you're doing a dry brushing technique, you're going to want to wet your bristles. So for this instance, I'm going to be using some blue and some of the red to start out making something of a deep violet. Now this particular mix of the cad red and the Prussian blue don't make a super good violet, but I'm not looking for a bright sort of chromatic purple violet color. I'm looking just for sort of a deep, slightly off color one. So I'm just kind of looking for that deep blue. We're essentially bringing some warmth into the blue, but not going crazy with it. Okay. Paper towels, very, very important. Okay, wetting my bristles, and you want to lay out a lot of paint. A lot of people don't want to lay out a lot of paint because the paint's expensive, and that's par for the course. Paint is expensive. It's going to be. I'm going to keep re-dipping and re-wetting my brush periodically, just to be sure my paint flows and spreads. Doesn't look like I actually made enough of this color. Well, maybe a little. So, at this point, like, okay, well, I'm going to blend color into color, but a lot of people don't realize at this point that this color is already starting to dry. So you need a lot of paint. You need a lot more paint than you might otherwise think you do. And if you've seen my tutorial on how to paint a blue sky, you'll note that this is basically the same thing. So from that, I'm just going to go straight into the red, use some of that dirty red that's already there, and lots of paint, because you want to have enough paint that you can blend color into color. And I'm working pretty quick here, and that's also a part of this as well. If you want to blend and work with that, you have to have enough paint, and you have to make sure that in having enough paint, you're keeping it wet. If you don't wet your brush, you probably won't be able to do this. And as long as the paint's wet, you can kind of blend some of that out. You can build some shapes in there. Indications of clouds, things like that. I'm going to wipe some of this color off in between brush loads to be sure I'm keeping more of a pure color in between. And this is very linear, very top to bottom. What you'll see when we move on to the section of layering is that we're not going to be doing that. We're going to be essentially breaking that all of the rules I'm telling you for this blending technique. And one of the things about acrylics, it's important to be able to do this on the fly, adapt as you work, so to speak. Because if you don't, you're going to run into those problems. Now, of course, this is a relatively small scale painting. If you're working on a larger surface, obviously you're using probably the same amount of water, at least with a bigger brush. But you want to make sure that you're using more paint for the application of a larger canvas. A lot of people want to, like, oh, well, I'm going to use this about this same amount of paint. I'm just going to do this twice the size. No, you're going to need more paint than that. One thing I will also have a look at in between watching the glare is as paint dries, it shrinks, specifically acrylics, because they're plastic. So it's kind of wet, but it'll shrink, and one thing you'll find is that you might end up having a couple little white spots where that where the paint has shrunk, that it's going to start showing through. So do keep in mind that as, again, the paint dries, you want to keep an eye out for those little white spots appearing. And as long as it's still a little bit wet, you can kind of keep blending that out. Okay, from this, I'm going to grab some yellow, start building that orange. And this is pretty simple. I'm just grabbing pure colors. I'm not mixing as I go, as I personally would normally. And here I'm coming right up on this edge, but I'm not blending in until that color's on the canvas first, because I don't want to muddy this color the further down I go. And anyone who's worked with watercolors or oils knows that the more you blend, the muddier your colors get. Specifically within really all painting mediums, sometimes less is more. Then once you're ready to kind of blend up, again, using all of that existing paint that's on the brush and on the canvas, as long as you used enough, you'll be able to just pull that color out. Actually, yeah, just rinse my brush and just get a little bit more, shaking off that excess. Working it in. And again, at this point you might be like, oh, I'm gonna keep blending, I want to keep blending. No, don't keep blending. Step back. It's a very common mistake, I would say, for a lot of people to just want to keep pushing the paint around it again and again and again and again. And at that point, you run out of good paint. At that point, you're like, well, now I'm just gonna. You blended it out so much that everything became muddy, and then you have to just layer on top of it, which you can do. But you lose a little bit of that brightness and a little bit more of the saturation with the color by doing so. And maybe if that's what you want, sure, you can tone down your color that way, but it's not really the best way to do that. And blending up those layers. And this is just a nice simple gradient. Anyone can do this. Keep in mind, though, if you're working with acrylics, you do want to work quickly. Specifically, if you're doing a quick one color into one color gradient like this. And this does take a little bit of practice, but it is also kind of easy to do. Okay, I'm going to grab a little bit of my white and a little bit of my yellow. Make this area where that sun would likely be and cascading right in the middle of this. Not using quite as much color for this section, but still enough to keep things moving around. And I might probably blend into the yellow a bit more to kind of tone that down. And that's right where our horizon's going to be. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, if you want to make a sun here, great, quick, easy way to do this, actually a quick tip on doing this, is just take the end of one of your fingers and make little circles in the paint, and then make little circles on the canvas. Super easy, super effective, does exactly what you're hoping it does. So that's the blending technique. Fast movement, wet your brush, lots of paint. And that's, if nothing else, if you remember nothing else, use lots of paint. Just keep using your paint. If you're worried about wasting the paint in the long run, highly recommend getting an empty jar of sorts. You don't have to use an empty paint jar. If you're a beginner, you probably don't have one of these at this point. Any kind of empty jar that has a nice seal on it, just scrape everything off and you end up with a nice gray color after a while, which ends up being a good base or starter color or starter base layer to certain things in your painting. But that is a tip and trick for another day. So now, again, we're going to go back, do the exact same thing on this side, but we want to do it in smaller increments. And if you're going to be layering, it's a really important, with any paints, is to work light to dark rather than the dark to light that we just did here. So in doing a light to dark, you're essentially going to be preserving the whites. So if you're going, for example, this yellow on top of this sort of deep bluish color, what you're going to find is this vibrancy won't be as strong, because yellow being innately a more transparent color will pick up more on the underlying darks, and it will be kind of washed out and kind of crappy looking, to be honest with you. You're like, why can't I get it this bright? Well, because your underlying colors are darker. So it's really important to understand that level of transparency in your paints. A good way to practice this, not just with acrylics, is to try it with watercolors. And you're like, why can't it think? Because it's really transparent. You have to really think of that light to dark mentality. So to start things out, we're, again, going reverse. We're going to start with the light. So I'm going to start with a little bit of that whiter color right in the middle. We won't start with the sun, but I do want to start building up just some of that lighter color right on that edge. And I'm working thinner here, nowhere near as much paint. So if you're worried about wasting paint, what you probably want to do is layer and not blend. You will find that the technique and the overall look to the piece, when we finish this side, it won't look exactly like this, obviously, because we're layering rather than blending. But you will see a little bit of a difference there. So a lot less paint. Still keep my bristles wet, but not as wet as they were, at least by any means. And this, again, you'll use a lot less paint, so if you're worried and you're on quite a bit of a budget, then you have to break that mentality of I have to blend and start thinking about how to layer. Now these edges, they're maybe a little wet, but not wet enough that blending is going to do a whole heck of a lot. So I'm actually going to come up a little bit further with this yellow to kind of think about where I want that and start working on that and let this dry as I'm working it. And I'm dipping back for more paint as I need it. I'm not grabbing all of it all at once. I'm not using so much that I'm feeling like now I have too much paint on my canvas. Not really an issue doing with more layering. Now, if you're this far into the video and you're thinking, wait a minute, I think I've seen this on this channel before. Technically, you have. I have done this demo before, not with a sunset, just with some simple color swatches, but this is technically a remake video. I recently found that old video, and I'm like, I don't like any of this. I should redo this. Okay, so now if this was, again, the blending technique, that we would then use a lot of color to just pull those colors together. But you don't necessarily have to do that. You can instead start blending in and working in smaller increments to be sure exactly what you're getting is what you want. So my paint is still a little wet here, so I could blend it out, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to layer in between, get a little more moisture here on the brush, and focus on pushing those individual smaller increments of color one after another onto the canvas. And in doing it this way, you also, I am actually blending a little bit as I go, but mixing on canvas really, not so much blending. You get a more painterly style in doing it this way, because you're just pulling that paint around and it's picking up way more on your brush strokes. And if you don't like brush strokes in your pieces, this isn't going to be a technique you probably like. But that said, you can kind of just slowly build that color up. Changes the shape of the clouds a little bit doing it this way. I mean, I can still kind of pull that out that way, but in this case, I just layered 3 different values on top of each other rather than trying to push those all together. It's a little bit slower of a process for sure. But again, if you're worried about wasting paint, slow down, do something like this. I'm actually starting to do something we'll talk about a little bit later, and that's selective dry brushing. By not doing it everywhere, but letting the texture of the canvas pick up on the paint and letting that texture be that transition. I can probably start moving on to a red, but I'm not going to go straight into that bright red that I did before. I'm actually going to start mixing an orange. Because I don't want, paint's probably almost a little too thin at this point. I don't want to have to, again, blend on canvas the way we just did. We're just going to slowly build that color up. So this is like one shade darker in value, using the red as my dark. And rather than blending the color in, I'm layering on top of this, this fringe. So we have the fringe here where the brushwork ends, and I'm layering it on top of that, and I'm coming down probably another couple of centimeters from there, or half of, about, that's got to be no more than a centimeter for that. And just letting the little bits of paint I have on the brush, again, pulling that across the canvas texture, and just letting that, that's a little too red, letting that layer just enough. That's a little bit more, and a little bit wet. Again, I don't want to, my instinct here is to blend this out, but we don't want to treat this as blending. So I'm actually less pulling with the brush and more just kind of tapping with it to kind of work that color in. Okay. A little more red up here. This actually looks like we're going to have a little bit more of a yellow section here with this one, but that's quite all right. I think I might have to grab a little bit more paint because my brush is starting to get a bit drier than I'd like. I mean, I can dip back to water, but I don't want to thin the paint at this point. I'm going to build this layer up here first, and then again work on that transition, pulling it down, but by mixing more incremental colors. Okay. Back for some yellow. Layer, 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 layer. Again, I'm not blending these colors together. All you're seeing is just brushwork on top of brushwork. So the yellow's underneath, the red's underneath. I'm coming back in with this orange over top, and I'm not blending them together. I'm just letting that edge of the brush hit, and wherever that taper was, wherever that maybe half brush stroke was, that's all you're seeing. You're not seeing any actual blending, well, maybe a little bit, just for the fact that the paint's a little wet, but you're not really seeing any other technique there besides, I do have to wet my brush a little at this point. Okay. One thing that you can do, this is actually a really fun technique, I think I also have a quick tip on this, is create that gradient on your brush. So you have red on one side of the brush, and you have yellow on the other side of the brush, and essentially what you create is this simple gradient on your brush that matches the gradient you're doing on the canvas. That way it's a little easier to do that layer than it might otherwise be. Now I don't actually like how fast this transition is here, so I'm probably going to go back in and add another mid value in between here. And because I'm using less paint, you're going to see more of those white spots popping up, again, as the paint shrinks and dries. Always something to consider as you're working. Okay, another layer on top of there. There we go. See, that's a much softer transition. Just very gently pulling with this brush, tapping and pulling. And while we're using the same bright saturated colors, you can probably already see how different the style is between the two of these. Do a slight, just pull it a little bit. Okay, go ahead and move into my dark. Pull that red. I'm just going to do all this mixing just with my brush. Red and the blue. Creates a nice sort of deep burgundy color. Almost a little bit brown. And if you are doing this, I might even be better to use the knife to blend out with, or at least to mix bigger batches of color. That way you're not guessing as often with what color you're going to be getting. You can get those incremental changes and have them already pre-mixed on your palette before you go into sticking everything on the canvas. It's also a good way to just practice mixing color values, just to do mixes on your palette and see what you get out of that. Okay, so I'm lacking a lot of this red now. I'm just going to come back into that more pure red. Still have a little bit of the blue in there, but not a ton. I'm just layering that back on top. I am using a little bit more paint here than I was doing down here. I am trying to keep this tutorial under, maybe a half hour, 30, 40 minutes. If I was really taking my time with this, I would actually just let all these layers dry in between. I wouldn't be doing this when all of them are so wet. Now in my work, I'll usually try to do more of a gradient blended sky and then use more of this texture in when I'm doing more of the other landscape elements. But that is more of a personal preference. I could absolutely pull this texture throughout the whole piece. Okay, that's pretty good. I'm just going to go ahead and get a little bit darker with our blue. Get a little closer to this color here. Just a tiny bit more water in this. And just pull that in. Still the same sky, different technique, different way of blending. I'm just going to come in and bring some clouds into here. Bring a few more down and in. And I could layer on top of this to do the same thing, but since this is way more about layering than it is about blending. And I did pull the clouds in here a bit, and I could have done that while it was still wet, but sometimes it's just easier and almost even more effective to do this when it's dry. Like so. Now, I am seeing some white spots popping up in here, so I will go out of my way right now to maybe get a little bit of that color back in and work some of that together. Now, I do want to talk briefly here about just other blending techniques. So, there are mediums that you can add to your paint to make them dry slower. There's a slow drying medium. Now, I don't have any of that in the studio. I've personally never found a use for it because I've always adapted and have been able to work with just bits of water and adding more paint. So you don't need to get slow drying medium. And also keep in mind, we'll alter your sometimes the viscosity of your paint and sometimes the transparency of your paint. So you might be adding a slow drying medium, but then it'll make your reds, your blues, your yellows even more transparent than they already are. So in changing that property, some of the advice I've given here today won't necessarily apply because, again, you're changing the properties of individual colors by adding that medium. Another option, which is totally great, it's something I've actually been doing more in my painting in the past few years, is by adding some of these golden open acrylics to my palette. These are the slow drying acrylics, so they do sort of what the slow drying medium does, but it's already tubed into paint and you don't have to worry about mixing and blending with a medium. So it already exists, and a lot of times I will be using one or two of these colors mixed with the heavy body to extend the time, but not extend the time to a huge extreme. And it tends to give me a little bit more working time in making a sky like this on usually a much larger scale. Now in terms of the layering technique, as I mentioned sort of briefly as I was working on it there, is you can do something that I have at this point now come to call selective dry brushing, where you come across some areas with a little bit less moisture on your brush to create, again, that more faux texture, and I did that way more with the white than I did with everything else, but creating and pushing that texture from the canvas to create the idea of blending while not actually blending. Another big part of doing anything with layering, specifically with any kind of acrylics, is to mix in other mediums and gels. So something like a regular matte gel or even a gloss gel can be great for that. Then something like a glazing liquid or like a GAC 100. Also really good options, especially if you're trying to do more techniques with layering colors that maybe don't layer naturally. So what do I mean by that? So if I was trying to mix like a blue into a yellow without getting it to look green, something like a glazing liquid or a gel would be really useful for that. You could also do it to actually make your yellows and blues to look like a green mix by using, again, more paint to medium ratio. But glazing is a slightly different horse. We're kind of just looking at brushwork and pretty basic stuff today. I also have a couple of videos on the glazing liquid versus gels in like gloss and matte gels, as well as the glazing liquid versus the GAC 100 in terms of how they change and adapt the colors. You can check those videos out. They already exist on the channel. But we're not gonna, this is not really a glazing demo so much as this is a layering blending demo. There's also people that use the glazes way better than I do, so you can likely find a better tutorial than I could give on glazing than I could try to do in the next 5 minutes. Now, before we get to our sort of final layer to all of this and final bits of tips, I'm actually going to grab more of this white and put a sundown in here too. Match that with the other one. And for this last bit of a layer, I'm going to grab a dark color. So, well, actually, really, 3 primaries. Let's make a dark color. Now, you might be tempted. I'm going to do a silhouette, much like the painting I'm basing these on. You might be really tempted in making and doing any silhouettes just to grab black paint. And while black paint certainly has its uses, you can actually find that specifically with something like a sunset, you will find that you don't have to use black to make it look black. The human eye is amazing in what it naturally does when certain colors are right next to each other. I'm sure you've probably seen there's a digital file floating around online if you look for optical illusions of sort of this box or a ball, and it's like which color gray is lighter and which one is darker. And when you kind of see them then compared side by side, you see that it's actually the same color gray, but because one appears next to lighter colors and one appears next to darker colors, or like a white and a black or something like that, your mind says, like, oh, well, that color must be darker or that color must be lighter. But they're actually the same color. So it's a play of physics, and it's really, really neat. So when you're looking to maybe mix a dark color for your paintings, don't necessarily reach for the black. So I've mixed up a bit of a brown that's a little more blue-leaning. A lot more blue-leaning. Blue is always a good shadow color for natural light. And for this, I'm actually breaking my only 2 brush rule or 1 brush rule for this video, and we're getting a fan brush. Actually, you know what? Just for nostalgic reasons, I am grabbing the same fan brush I did for that painting when I was 14. Still have it. Still great. So we're making some good old-fashioned Bob Ross pine trees. Fan brush. Lots of paint on the brush. I'm just going to drop in a couple of lines for where I want them. At least the big ones, anyway. 1, 2, 3, 4. Put a fifth one there. Why not? Corner of the brush, back and forth motions. Start at the tip of the bristle and the tip of the tree. And just boop, 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 boop. Slowly pressing a little bit more the further down you go. Till you hit the horizon. Even if you're not following this tutorial for the sake of it being a layering blending tutorial, I think this is also a great demo if you just want to learn how to make a quick and easy painting. Quick and dirty painting, I should say. Because again, these are simple, basic techniques. Pretty easy. Any painter can do them. I would know. Again, and this piece was, again, based on something I did. I was 14 years old. I'd been painting for a couple of years, but not making anything real fantastic. And I think it was actually my mom that showed me a lot of the stuff in this painting. She's like, here, let me show you how to do something really easy. And it worked. And I was like, wow, I'm going to do this forever now. So I will not be offended if you totally steal this from me. This is a great, simple way to create paintings that will impress nearly everybody in your life. Whether you do that blending technique like this, or the blending technique, the layering technique, works all the same. Now, one thing you can do here, and actually I might while I'm still waiting for that to dry. Now that we've put those dark clouds in, you can mix a color closer to that yellow, for the white yellow, and you can put highlights on them just by kind of tapping on that. I was working on a painting last week, and I did this, where I put in these clouds and then put this little bit of light on the edge of them. Like that. A little bit of subtle light coming through there. All right. I'm just having fun now. All right. So, a couple of big trees, and then load up a little bit more paint. And then just vertically with the brush, just tap. And it looks like a bunch of little ones in the distance. And I'm coming up a bit more because I want to hide this layer where this hits just to the white. I don't want to see that white underneath. So I want to make it seem a little more seamless. And I could absolutely then layer in some lighter greens and yellows in here. But again, paintings for other days. Not necessarily what we need to do today. And much like the sky, don't go overboard, just, little bits here and there. Just blend out the rest of that. Just grab a little water, just so that moves. And again, simple things you can do here to make this a more dynamic landscape. Take some of the sky color before you start adding the black in. Put in a stream, a river, a lake. That way it's actually reflecting the color of the sky. It's also why it's nice to mix up bigger batches of paint. Even though in acrylics they're going to dry faster, you can have some of that color to add an extra element through the piece, if you so desire. Just going to pull this out with a lot more water. Wouldn't normally use this much water at this point, but I just want to cover that white up. Like that. Simple, easy landscape. Blending plus layering. Same deal here. We were layering here. Now, one thing that's cool, and it looked like I dripped some of that black paint when I added the water here. I don't even think that shows up on camera, but that's all right. If you made any mistakes in the sky here that you really don't like, cover them with paint. There's a joke I have with a friend of mine. It's like, yeah, just make it a tree. So actually, this transition right here, I hate. So I'm going to put a tree on it and hide the mistake, essentially. 1, 2, 3. What did I do? 6 over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. Okay, 3. Hiding more mistakes there. I had that drop of paint on the sun. I didn't like that. Also, glazing helps you hide mistakes too. I see a lot of white spots up in here. At that point, I'd come in and glaze over that. And ta-da, 2 simple, quick, easy landscapes. 2 different blending techniques, or really blending, layering. 2 different techniques, both super effective and really fun, really easy to do. Again, anyone can do these. I've been doing these for 15 years. I know what I'm doing. But these are simple things, just enough paint on one side or selective paint on the other side. Super fun, super easy. I hope you guys can try these for yourself. So now, from a distance, here's our 2 examples. Kind of look better from far away, I think. And honestly, I've impressed myself with this. I'm going to do a big one of these paintings again. These are really fun. As a final review, remember, if you're blending, use more paint if you're using acrylics. Don't necessarily have to do that with oils or watercolors, but with acrylics, you got to use more if you want it to look a little bit cleaner. If you're worried about using more, maybe just try to do some simple layering and slowly build that color up through incremental changes in value and hue. Almost forgot the word there. Doing that slow, subtle transition, or a slow, subtle transition when the paint's still really wet, and you've got a lot of it. Both are effective, both look great, but of course create 2 different painterly styles. So it's important to think about what you want your piece to look like and kind of how you want to go about developing your own sort of painting style and what works well for you. If you like this one better, maybe you like that subtle transition, you'll be using a little less paint in the long run, but chances are you're going to create a style that is more brushwork heavy. Or if you like the more blending style, you're probably going to create something that's more graphical and has simple, cleaner lines. For this, I think where I sit is I really do just mix them both up a little bit depending on what I'm going to do for the piece. And I think that works. So as always, if you found this tutorial useful, interesting, or just enjoyed watching me paint, go ahead and hit that like button. Let me know your thoughts and comments below of anything you still might be struggling with after watching this. Get subscribed if you're not already. Check me out in social links in the description box below, including a community Discord where you can chat with me personally, ask me questions outside of the public forum. I said all that other stuff. Keep on creating, and I will see you guys next time.